My guest today fought as a U.S. Marine in the Gulf War, but is now going to Iraq for a very different reason. His plan to lead a group of anti-war protesters and offer himself as a human shield in the event that an attack takes place. Is he an idealist or just a willing tool for Iraqi propaganda? Kenneth OKeefe, a very warm welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't you go to Iraq and tell Saddam that he can avoid war simply by cooperating with the United Nations?
Well, I think the United Nations has already dishonored itself. You remember back last July, the United Nations Security Council voted unanimously to provide immunity to the United States. There's 5 nations that have veto powers.
Why has it dishonored itself in the case of Iraq?
Well, I don't trust the United Nations to begin with, and they've dishonored themselves by saying that they would give immunity to the United States. So I don't really care what the United Nations says. I don't really care if they give a resolution endorsing war.
So you have no interest in what the world community and the 200 or so nations that make up the United Nations actually say?
Is the United Nations the world community? As far as I can tell, the vast majority of people on this planet stand directly opposed to this war. I don't believe the United Nations represents the world community.
Certainly represents a lot of the elected governments.
I don't believe the government of England is representing the majority of the people in England. I don't believe that the government of the United States is representing the majority there either.
You say most people against the war. The opinion polls aren't that simple. The latest opinion polls show division, but January the 19th, the latest poll in Britain, those who approve or don't know about a war amount to 53% of the population. That's not the majority against the war, is it? You can shrug, but it's not the majority.
I question that. I mean, I've just
Why?
heard that.
Because it doesn't tally with your own ideas.
No, not at all. How do you get 400,000 people out in the streets in London, 1 million in Florence, Italy, protests around the world? I think it's quite obvious that the vast majority of people do not support this war. And I don't think any logical thinking person would believe that the world will be a better place if U.S. bombs are dropped on an already thoroughly victimized people. I think that's an insult to our intelligence to believe that that would make the world a better place.
You can say that, but again, the figures don't back you up. It's easy to say that, but you haven't got the figures on your side.
You don't believe that the majority of people are against this war?
The governments say they're against the war. They say it's a last resort. They don't want to go to war unless it's a last resort.
Do you really believe
Each of the governments have said that.
Do you really?
It doesn't matter what I believe.
Well, I don't
believe. It's a matter of what the people out there believe.
Well, what's being said and what's really intended to be done are two different things, in my opinion. The United States intends to carry out this war because they need to dominate the world by having the oil reserves. And by controlling the second largest oil reserves, they will basically have veto power over the world by controlling the means of production through the control of the oil.
So you don't think it's worth saying to Saddam Hussein, why not cooperate?
Now, well, Saddam Hussein...
The world has waited 12 years, during which time you've built up your arms again. You're skeptical about that too.
Well, they can't find them. Where are they? I mean, where are they?
The UN inspectors say we feel the declaration by Iraq to the UN has not answered a great many questions of the past. They haven't had long, have they? They've only had a few weeks there.
What's the point of even having inspectors going in if Saddam is supposed to produce proof that he has nothing? How do you prove you have nothing? If the UN inspectors have a real job, then their job is to go in and find these weapons. They can't find them.
You say he's already disarmed from what we can tell. How do you know? How do you know?
Well, if he has anything, it's minuscule.
But how do you know? You make these glib statements which have no basis in fact. How do you know he's disarmed?
Well, we can't find him. Why do we have inspectors going in there?
Well, for 4 years we didn't have any inspectors in. They've only been in for a few weeks. It's a country of 177,000 square miles. It might take a bit of time.
Well, why even send in inspectors then? Why don't we just go ahead and drop the bombs and get it over with?
Isn't the point is that the Western governments know exactly what Saddam Hussein has, because as you've been telling the rest of the world, they gave it to him in the first place.
Well, there's no doubt
so they
about
do
that.
know. They do know what he's got.
Well,
so when they say he's
had.
got it, they're
Right.
speaking from experience.
Is that not a major irony that they were the ones that gave him to him? And
That's
then
neither here nor there. They know what he's got. You're saying he's disarmed. They know what he's got.
I really kind of resent this focus on others instead of focusing on the crimes of our own governments. Since our governments produced these weapons and provided them to these sadistic tyrants around the world, including Suharto or Pinochet or a long list of people like that, isn't it more important that we focus on what our governments have been doing instead of pointing the finger elsewhere, which we have little control over? I really resent this. The U.S. and Britain are criminal for having supplied these weapons and continuing that favored nation trading partner status after he committed his worst crime. So I would point the finger at ourselves first. Then we have a legitimate right to look at Saddam and the crimes that he's committing. But until then, we're hypocrites.
And Saddam isn't criminal to have used those weapons?
He is. Of course he is. But I do not have control over what Saddam does. But if we live in so-called democracies, then we are supposed to have true representation. And we do not, because the majority of people do not want to support vicious, nasty tyrants who are killing people. But what it does do for our governments, who again I do not believe represent us, is ensure that the flow of resources will continue to be plundered from the rest of the world back into the West, into the filthy rich hands of people who want to see this kind of tyranny continue.
Peace depends on two sides in a dispute, doesn't it? And you only seem to be addressing one.
No, not at all. The Iraqi people, the last thing they need is for bombs to be dropped on them. I'm going down there. People can read into it whatever they want. But the fact is that I simply cannot stand by and watch another atrocity be committed on behalf of the West that I come from. It sickens me and it saddens me. And I would much rather sit down there with the Iraqi people, perhaps hug each other, look into each other's eyes, express our humanity, and if the bombs need to drop, then let the world watch that. And if that's the way they feel about it and that's what they want, well, then shame on all of us for allowing it.
You haven't worried so much about the Iraqi people and the plight they've been in for the last 12 years.
I wish I had done more. I wish I had done more. You're right.
When they were under repression and humiliation by their own regime,
that's right.
Torture, execution. You haven't worried about that very much.
No, I've definitely worried about it, but I have not done as much as I could have.
Why not?
I'm trying to make
Why
up.
not? Why not?
Because I'm a human being, and I'm also subject to the same pressures and the same desires of any human being. I wish I could have done more. Now I'm trying to make up for it. If we want to look at what I couldn't have done, shouldn't we focus on the things that I can do now instead of what I haven't done in the past? And I have worked on issues dealing with human rights and other issues relating to the Iraqi situation. But I'm one person, and I cannot save the world, and I've never claimed to save the world, but I can do the best that I can do. And I hope that people will see that they can do more as well.
Isn't what you're actually doing assisting in a process which could allow this frightful regime to last a little longer? What help is that to the Iraqis which you profess to care so much about?
Well, if you look at the protests that are going on in Iraq right now, they're against
government-sponsored
I don't believe that.
You don't believe that people are free to protest in Iraq,
I don't believe that all of these. I don't believe that these are all people who are being forced into protesting against the U.S. I believe that these people in Iraq.
How many anti-government demonstrations do you see in Iraq?
Many of them, most of them hate Saddam, but they hate America even more.
Mr. O'Keefe, how many anti-government demonstrations do you see in Iraq?
How many anti-government demonstrations? They don't exist.
No, they don't exist.
You and I both know that.
Exactly.
You and I both know that.
Exactly. So the demonstrations.
But are you saying that means that there's no legitimacy to anti-U.S. protests over there? Are you saying that these people don't feel that way?
It does cut the credibility a little, doesn't it?
Well,
when you can only demonstrate one way.
Slightly, but I think even you will acknowledge that they definitely do not like the United States over there.
You say Saddam isn't stupid.
I don't think he's stupid. He
wasn't that clever to go into the Gulf War in the first place.
Well, he got suckered into that now, didn't he? Because you know that the high-level U.S. diplomat, forget his name, her name, went in there the day before they invaded Kuwait.
One U.S. diplomat
went in and told him
invading a whole country.
No. They went in there the day before he invaded and said that this was a regional issue, that Kuwait was not a protectorate, basically gave him the green light. Now, remember, he was a favored
There's a lot of dispute over that. That's one version of it, and you know there are plenty of other versions of it.
I believe Noam Chomsky's documented that amongst other people, and I trust their integrity.
Noam Chomsky has a particular view to push, doesn't he?
What view is that? This man is a true American. He cares about America and is exposing the crimes of America. I think that's being a patriot. I don't think he has an agenda.
Isn't it one-sided just to expose the crimes of just one country? And again, you know, there are two sides in this dispute. You don't seem to want to address the crimes that Saddam has carried out.
I have a responsibility to look at the actions of the government in which I came from and was a part of and paid taxes to. I'm not saying ignore the others around the world that are committing crimes. Of course not. But don't we have a greater obligation to the nations from which we come? I think we do.
12 years ago, Mr. O'Keefe, you went off happily to war in the Gulf as a loyal, patriotic U.S. Marine. Was it right to liberate Kuwait then from Iraqi invasion?
Well, actually, I believe in international law. I very much do, and I believe that people, small nations, should be protected from larger nations. In fact, I come from Hawaii. If we look at the history of Hawaii, the United States had conspired to overthrow the legitimate and lawful government. In fact, if you look at
Iraq was wrong.
United States Public Law 103-150 clearly states that the Americans stole the Hawaiian nation and the Hawaiian people never gave it up.
We're talking about Iraq.
But how is it possible that we talk about Kuwait?
How did we get from Iraq to Hawaii?
Because I believe in international law.
Okay, but I'm asking you about a specific example.
If law is applied arbitrarily and it's applied unevenly, then it's not law at all. It's the color of law.
So was it lawful?
If law is to be applied in favor of the Kuwaiti government at the expense of the Iraqis, because they're victimized by the Iraqis, then the Hawaiian nation needs to be honored as well against the brutal and oppressive policies of the United States in Hawaii. States had conspired to overthrow the legitimate and lawful government. In fact, if you
So
look
Iraq was wrong.
United States Public Law 103-150 clearly states that the Americans stole the Hawaiian nation and the Hawaiian people never gave it up.
We're talking about Iraq.
But how is it possible that we talk about Kuwait?
How did we get from Iraq to Hawaii?
Because I believe in international law.
Okay, but I'm asking you about a specific example.
If law is applied arbitrarily and it's applied unevenly, then it's not law at all. It's the color of law.
So was it lawful?
Now, if law is to be applied in favor of the Kuwaiti government at the expense of the Iraqis, because they're victimized by the Iraqis, then the Hawaiian nation needs to be honored as well against the brutal and oppressive policies of the United States in Hawaii.
Can we get back to the question? Can we back
to the question?
You've had your run around the houses. Can we go back to the question, which is, was Iraq justified in attacking Kuwait and invading Kuwait?
No, it wasn't. But it does. That question does ignore the fact that the lines that were drawn by the British were basically an insurance policy that there would be division and fighting and hostility and border disputes and all sorts of stuff.
So you're making excuses for the fact that he went into Kuwait?
Let's not ignore the historical reality behind why that invasion occurred in the first place. I'm not justifying it. As I've said, I believe in international law. But when international law is applied in one way, where the powerful dictate when law is applied,
so the world should have left
nothing but the color of law.
You went to fight you thought it was a just war.
I was young, and I was a bit naive.
You thought it was a just war.
I thought there was some legitimacy to it, yes, but I did not have the understanding.
And you still do?
I think there was some legitimacy to it.
What action did you see?
Well, my unit earned a combat action ribbon. I never fired my weapon, but I do know what it sounds like to have a bullet fly by. As I said, my unit did earn that combat action ribbon, so I guess technically I've seen combat. My job was, in the unit I was with, to secure the road that led from Kuwait City to Baghdad, which is otherwise known as the Highway of Death, where 20,000 plus Iraqis, retreating Iraqis, were slaughtered by cowards flying planes, pushing buttons, sending missiles down to people who wanted to live.
You were a loyal Marine. You were doing what you thought was your patriotic duty.
I did the job that I was called to do, yes.
The job that you were paid to do.
Yes.
Were you scared of dying?
I contemplated death, yes. I did reflect on my mortality. I even began...
In what terms?
Well, I realized that I might not survive, and that I might not see those that I love very much again, and that causes you to reflect.
You did the job, but you did the job willingly. You were loyal, you were committed, you'd gone through pretty rigorous training. You must have believed in what you were doing.
I knew that
nobody forced you into the Marines, did they?
No, of course not. I've admitted on record it was perhaps the stupidest thing I've ever done, but in the end it's actually turned out to be one of the best things, because...
But at the time you were proud of the unit, proud of the people you served with.
There would be a little bit more explanation needed, but essentially,
no,
yes.
give me the explanation.
Well, I was treated in an arbitrarily negative way while I was in the Marine Corps because I spoke out on something, and this was something...
You were a difficult guy.
Yeah, I've always been the kind of guy who doesn't accept power being abused, no matter who's delivering it.
Or a problem with authority, which was it?
I don't have a problem with authority when it's just, but when it's being abused, I have a big problem with it, no matter where it comes from.
You were in an altercation about air conditioning on board a ship in the Mediterranean.
It really seems quite trivial, but yes,
bit petty, wasn't it?
Well, the thing is that the troops that have to deal with the reality of all sorts of duties, who are being told to do something by their superiors, who are telling them that leadership by example is what the Marine Corps is all about. I think that I had a responsibility to expose these so-called leaders for what they were, which was not leading by example, and I was punished as a result of speaking out. Now, I could have done this anonymously, what I did, and this is a longer story, and I don't want to waste too much time on it, but I could have...
No, but it says something about you, doesn't it?
It does. I could have done this anonymously. I could have reported them anonymously, but I owned up to it. I said, I'm the one who did it, and because of that, I paid very dearly.
Because of this argument over air conditioning, you actually abused them. You were accused of abusing. You accused them of abusing their power, didn't you?
I don't accuse it. They did abuse their power. They had no right.
That's a pretty serious charge over air conditioning, isn't it?
No, they had no right to close off a passageway on a ship. That is reserved to the captain and the highest enlisted Navy personnel on board the ship. They had no right to do it. It was an abuse of power. They were making life more difficult for others, and all the while they're telling us to lead by example.
And you still think you did the right thing?
Absolutely.
You still don't think it was a petty thing and a petty quarrel to have picked?
No, definitely not. I stand by it.
Even though you say a lot of Marines would no doubt describe me as a provocateur or bad apple, but to my mind I did the right thing.
I did do the right thing, and all the jobs that I was required to do, such as carrying a heavy pack long distances and knowing how to fire my weapon, knowing tactics, I did those things extremely well. I carried myself with honor, I stood by what I did, I owned up to it honestly, and I paid a price.
While serving your country in the Marines, you knew about your country's history, you knew that it had done bad things in Chile, for example, in Latin America, things that the Clinton administration in many cases actually apologized for later. But it was okay then.
No, actually, I didn't know those things.
Why not?
The first one, because I was stupid, and I didn't learn it, and I was lied to, because they didn't teach me these things in school. In fact, I didn't even know what the U.S. Constitution
You know that
said.
every country does bad things, or has done bad things in its history.
Yeah. But I also know that the United States has had an incredibly, enormous amount of bad things. In fact, I have no question about the United States being the #1 terrorist of the 20th and now the 21st centuries. We look back at
That's a pretty emotive name to throw at a country that's just suffered, you know, September the 11th.
Yeah, 3,000 lives compared to, say, 3 million in Southeast Asia. How incredible it is that we value white life. White life, it seems, is worth about 10,000 or 20,000 or 100,000 dark-skinned lives. It's sick, it's twisted, it's criminal, it's hypocritical, and I want no part of it.
But isn't it a bit ludicrous to describe the government of America as criminal, democratically elected, rather than, let's say, Saddam Hussein, who remains in power by torturing and killing his opponents? It's a bit ludicrous to compare them.
Not at all, not at all, because I do not endorse Saddam Hussein, but at least he's confined it generally to his region or his own country. America.
Well, that makes killing fine,
No, it does not. I don't endorse Saddam Hussein, nor anyone who kills or tortures people, but America has exported their terror all around the world. You know that, and I know it.
After the Marines, you left, what, 8 months after the Gulf War?
Yeah, roughly.
Lived in Hawaii, as you've said. Set up your own business?
Well, that was a few years later that I moved to Hawaii, yes.
Why did you start to hate America?
I don't hate America. In fact, I don't hate anyone. I don't even hate George Bush.
But you gave up your U.S. citizenship.
I renounced my U.S. citizenship, yes.
What, is a slap in the face?
No, not at all. Citizenship is allegiance, and in order to be allegiant to something, you need to agree with what it's doing. I don't agree with the United States exporting terror around the world. I don't agree with paying into the largest military budget in the world, more than every other nation combined, spending on military. I don't agree with that. Now, as a citizen, basically, you have an allegiance to that. What I did was logical. I said, I have no part of that, I want no part of it, so therefore, you can take your citizenship and I will walk away.
But going to a country like Iraq, which systematically violates human rights, and using that country as a platform to attack your own, is an act of hatred, isn't it?
No, I definitely don't feel hatred, absolutely not. If anything, I feel anger, and I'll be the first one to admit that. I'm angry, and I think any logical, thinking, compassionate person would be angry when they see people being killed all around the world, especially when it's being done in their name. But I'm not hateful, and I don't let the anger control me. I use it the best way I can, the most constructive way I can. Really,
why not inside the country? Why not go to the States?
I would have ended up in. Maybe you know there was a bench warrant issued for my arrest as well, an $11,000 bench warrant, which is posted on my website if people want to look at it. I was being persecuted, and I probably would have ended up as one of the many in the world's largest prison population and growing.
You'd have had a lot of publicity in the process.
No, I wouldn't. You wouldn't even have heard of me if I didn't end up for some bogus charge.
Have you become a pacifist?
I'm not a passive anything, and I think Gandhi said that as well. I believe in action.
I'm interested in you. Are you a pacifist? Do you believe that there's a case for going to war?
I believe that self-defense is the only legitimate reason for war, and this whole preemptive doctrine of the Bush administration is sheer suicide. By the preemptive doctrine, Pakistan should invade India, India should invade Pakistan, North Korea should invade South Korea, the Israelis should attack Palestinians.
Can we just stay in the region where we are?
No, because the whole world is connected. We cannot disconnect these things. They're all connected.
We're trying to deal with well, you're not going to all these places. You're going to Iraq.
But based on the preemptive doctrine, basically every nation that has an enemy would have the right to attack their enemy.
You reject war with Iraq, but what do you put in its place? You said, I would argue that if Saddam did have those weapons, we should establish a dialogue. What do you think the UN has been doing with him for the last 12 years?
Well,
Kofi Annan has been to Baghdad. Countless UN officials have been to talk to him. Arab states have talked to him. The Saudis, the Arab League has had him in. Discussion after discussion. Why would your dialogue be different?
I'm not saying that it would be, and all I can do is say what I say and hope that it ends up being constructive in some way. But what right do you have, or what right do our nations have to go in there and tell these people what to do? Do you know what kind of conditions black people have lived under in America? Do you know about the genocide that continues to be perpetuated?
Why do you always widen it out? Why can't we stay with this particular subject?
Because I
find you throw everything into the pot. They're all different situations. They all have different nuances. You can't throw everything into the same pot, stir it up, and make one case for action against everybody.
What you keep doing is pointing the finger at someone else and ignoring the responsibility of our own governments.
I'm asking what you suggest. You subject.
Because I
find you throw everything into the pot, They're all different situations. They all have different nuances. You can't throw everything into the same pot, stir it up, and make one case for action against everybody.
What you keep doing is pointing the finger at someone else and ignoring the responsibility of our own governments.
I'm asking what you suggest. You reject war. I'm asking what you suggest be done in this instance.
I think the best thing for us to do as people right now is to get down to Iraq, 10,000 plus of us, to get down there, to share our humanity, and by doing that, perhaps somehow, some way, we can empower the Iraqi people to compel their so-called leader to do the right thing. And if they can't, then perhaps they should go one step further. But it's their business, not ours, and we have no right to even pretend to care about the Iraqi people. We supplied the man who gassed them. Let's be honest about that. And if we want a better world, we've got to be honest. We don't care. The West does not care. American government does not care about the Iraqi people. And neither does the British government. It's sheer hypocrisy that they would pretend to care.
And is caring going to Iraq and allowing yourself to be used as a propaganda tool by the regime? Because they are going to do. You're going to get very nice coverage in the Baghdad newspapers, hardly a beacon of freedom of expression, very nice pictures on Baghdad television. You may even be garlanded with flowers. What's that going to do for the Iraqi people?
I'll tell you how wonderful it's going to feel to get down there and to look into an Iraqi person's eyes and know that they see some hope, that they see that there's a person from the West who sees the truth and would rather be down there with them if the bombs drop than sit back here and be a hypocrite and talk about peace. I think that that'll be one of the most enriching experiences of my life.
You could have looked into an Iraqi exile's eyes here in London, somebody who had to run for his life.
Where I lived in Holland, I lived with a man who has family who died in Halabja from the gas attacks. He's shown me a videotape. This man respects me and I respect him. I've also become friends with a man who spent 7 years in an Iraqi prison, 4 years in solitary confinement. This man respects me and I respect him. I'm doing what I feel is best, and I am standing with the Iraqi people, and no one in their right mind could equate me to supporting Saddam Hussein. But I can't stop people from saying that sort of rubbish.
Rubbish? John Levins, a man who was held as a human shield in the war. He said, I asked Mr. Nichols to desist from using that description, human shield. It's an insult to the suffering of those people and their families that they went through. You are not human shields when you put yourself in harm's way voluntarily. You're tools of the Iraqi regime and nothing short of collaborators in the repression visited upon the Iraqi people.
Well, I'm really glad you gave me an opportunity to respond to that, because John is a banker. And he was down in Kuwait to make money. And I've seen pictures of John.
He was used as a human shield.
Let me respond to what he said. This man, I've seen pictures of him with his family shaking hands with Saddam Hussein, big smiles on all their faces. And now I'm wrong because I go down to Iraq in potential harm's way to stand with the Iraqi people. This man was a banker and all he cared about was money, and he's going to condemn me because I want to go down there and be with the Iraqi people?
He's not alone in condemning you. Well, you've stirred up quite a bit of anger,
of course.
as you know.
When you talk as straight as I do, you're going to make enemies. You know that.
You made a lot of enemies on this.
That's right, and I've made a lot of friends around the world who believe that I'm speaking the truth, that I'm sincere and I'm passionate, and I'm willing to die, if necessary, to fight for what we need to do in this world to make it a better place. And I know that we're going to destroy ourselves unless we turn it around fast.
Wouldn't it be harder, the hardest thing to do would actually be to sign up for an aid agency, some of those who are preparing to deal with the humanitarian tragedy that will result, maybe, if there is a war, people who are planning to try to help people in a concrete way? Wouldn't that be more valuable?
I think that everybody has something to offer, and if that's what feels right to someone else, then I encourage them to do that. I would certainly support anyone doing what they feel is right. My way is the way I'm doing it right now. I stick to what I believe. Every time I've done something that I felt was right, it ended up being the right thing to do. Maybe I would be more effective somewhere else. I don't know. But I do believe that what I'm doing right now is having a huge impact, and I'm inspired by what I see around the world. For all the people that hate me, I think there's probably 100 or 1,000 that actually very much appreciate what I'm doing.
Do you seriously think that if the UN or an American-led coalition starts an invasion, that they will care whether you're there or not? Or indeed the Iraqi people would even care whether you're there if the bombs start falling?
You know, as far as the Iraqi people, I think it will mean something, yes, that we came down there. As far as the U.S. government, no. They're murderous, and I do not believe for a second that they want what's right in this world. This is all about power and global domination. And I think anyone who's got their eyes open realizes that.
Kenneth OKeefe, good to have you on the program. Thanks very much.
Israel has eased its blockade on the Gaza Strip. Not by as much as some would like, but the Middle East envoy Tony Blair says it is a good start. It follows the death of 9 Turkish activists killed by Israeli soldiers when they raided an aid flotilla as it tried to break the naval blockade of Gaza. Ken OKeefe, my guest today, was on that boat and involved in the violence. So was it worth it? Ken OKeefe, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you for having me.
The blockade on Gaza has now been eased, so do you consider what you did a success?
Well, I consider the easing to be unacceptable. I consider that to be a euphemism for there's still a blockade. The blockade is unacceptable in every way, and until it's completely broken, then there is no success. On that day, there'll be partial success, but ultimately the goal is not just the ending of the blockade, but to have real stability, security, and peace in that region. So until we achieve that, there is no success.
Do you think that partial success, as you call it thus far, was worth the lives of 9 Turkish men?
Absolutely, and I say that not lightly at all, because Palestinians die every day, and we don't hear about them in the news like we've heard about them in the flotilla. And it seems as if the Palestinian lives don't equate to non-Palestinian lives. I don't agree with that. Palestinian lives are every bit as precious as every other person's life, yet they die on a regular basis.
But aren't there other ways of doing it? 9 men lost their lives. Isn't there another way to convince Israel to ease its blockade?
Well, there's no question at all that before this flotilla happened and the violence that Israel perpetrated on that ship, there was no real talk of ending the blockade, easing the blockade. America was standing behind its policy of supporting Israel unconditionally. The Egyptians were collaborating with the Israeli and American policy in keeping Rafah closed. And ultimately, there was no real talk from the EU or the United Nations. So only because people have died and done what they are capable of doing do we see any real movement at all. I don't know how we can possibly ignore that.
Let's turn to what happened on that morning when the Mavi Marmara was boarded by Israeli soldiers. The Israeli Defense Forces released video that they have obtained of the event, and we can take a look at it here now. Where were you at the time? Were you on the top of the ship?
I was one deck below the top deck where the commandos are coming down.
What the Israeli Defense Force say about this is that, and it's clear from some of the video, that it was when the first soldier came down that he was attacked.
Yeah, what the Israelis are not revealing is all the footage that would not support their whole idea of what happened on that evening. There's lots of footage that has been confiscated and is held in control of the Israelis. I saw one dead body before I came into contact with the first commando that I helped to disarm, and he was shot right square in the forehead, and I know this man was a photographer and was not holding any weapon at all. Before they started coming from the helicopters, they came from the boats at the sides and were firing percussion grenades. They were also firing rounds, which it would appear have been live rounds as well, and ultimately they were using all means to cause disruption and chaos. It was an attack. It wasn't a boarding, it was an attack.
Israel says that when they went on board, they used rubber bullets and paint guns, which they used for riot dispersal. And it was only when a firebomb was thrown at them that one of their soldiers was stabbed, and when their pistols were taken off them, that they used live ammunition.
You know, Ehud Barak said before we let out on that mission that they would use any means to stop us, and at any price they would stop us. That's his declaration before we headed out. The Israeli lies are continuous and incessant, and the ultimate proof of that is that they will not allow the evidence which would be counter to their argument to be released. They control all of the evidence that's being released at this point.
But what is clear from those videos, and there's videos available as well where you can see somebody, and it would appear to be the first soldier, as soon as he lands, he is being beaten. A second one come down, the same thing happens.
You know, I actually don't have any problem with acknowledging that. It's pretty clear from the video, and what I will do is use Gandhi as an example. I subscribe to Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence first and foremost, but under certain circumstances, i.e., when you're being attacked and people's lives are at stake, you have every right to defend yourself, and I shall...
That is exactly...
Let's watch this then.
Well, let's watch this, but that is exactly the argument that Israel itself would use. I mean, this has been the the writing on the screen was put there by the Israeli Defense Force, but it's clear what you can see. The Israeli soldiers are being attacked, and their argument is they were only acting in self-defense.
Sure. And you know what the problem is with that argument? The problem is that there are 1.5 million people in Gaza, among them 800,000 plus children. Children who have been subjected to medieval-type situations.
We can get on to the situation in Gaza. Let's just deal with what happened on that ship.
This ship and this mission was intended to break that blockade, which is violating children every single day. Every single day.
But the intention to block the blockade, because you say, look, Israel had certain intentions before it came on board. They're saying certain things about those people on the ship. What was the intention? What did you plan before they boarded the ship?
The plan was to break the blockade and deliver aid which is critically needed to the population of Gaza, which has been subjected to an inhumane, illegal, collective punishment policy which subjects 800,000 plus children to conditions that we wouldn't tolerate for one day in Britain or the United States or any other civilized country.
If you want to win the argument, you also need to be clear about what happened on that ship.
I'm clear about it. We used non-lethal means to defend ourselves. I myself took possession of one weapon, a 9mm pistol from an Israeli commando, and I took that weapon, I separated the bullets, which were real bullets, by the way. I separated the bullets from the weapon. We, on that ship, that night, had possession of 3 Israeli commandos. 3 Israeli commandos, completely disarmed, completely at our mercy. Do you know what we did with those commandos? Do you know what we did with them?
Well, I know you eventually released them.
We released them. Does that sound like people who are hell-bent on killing Israelis and attacking Israelis?
Israel's argument, as you know, is always that it is unfair, that the true picture doesn't get seen. Who fired first?
The Israelis made it clear that they would stop us at, quote, any price. That's Ehud Barak, who needs to face war crimes charges for attacking a civilian passenger ship on a humanitarian aid mission in international waters, no less. We've heard so much about Somali pirates. What about the Israeli pirates?
Interviews with those on board in advance of it, there are those who said, and the organizer of the ship said the intention was to reach Gaza or die. Others said, either we will die as martyrs or we'll reach Gaza. And there were those on board interviewed on the ship who talked of waiting for the battle. Was that the intention? Did you expect violence? Did you want violence?
Of course not. Any person who's sane would not want violence. You'd rather justice and peace. Ultimately, the atmosphere on that ship, from all the way up until that attack, was very positive, very uplifted, a feeling of exercising one's consciousness and humanity. There wasn't a hope that we would be attacked. Our hope was to arrive in Gaza.
Was there an expectation? Look,
no,
you're a former military man, you're a former U.S. Marine.
I can speak for myself. I was on the first Free Gaza mission in August 2008. August 23rd, that arrived in Gaza. 2 boats, 46 passengers. The Israelis said all the way up to the moment of departure that we were nothing better than pirates and they would treat us as such and that they were not going to allow us through. And we got through because enough of the world was paying attention. And ultimately, that's the only reason why we got through. So the Israelis were saying the same exact thing this time, but I thought, mistakenly, that the Israelis would not be so stupid as to attack a civilian ship in international waters on a clearly humanitarian mission which is intended to help people, including 800,000 plus children, who were completely innocent and cannot be subjected to such treatment.
What were the preparations in advance on the ship? Preparations that, I don't know...
To defend it. To defend it.
So the images that the Israeli Defense Force have released of wooden batons, of pipes being sawn in preparation...
I don't have any problem with that. The knives I have a problem with, because we were specifically told not to use any knives. Knives could be lethal.
But you know that there were those on board who had knives and used knives.
Really? Where's the proof? What, from Israel? They're lying. They lie incessantly.
Are the soldiers who were wounded lying?
They're telling the truth?
What about the soldiers who were wounded?
Those soldiers should be dead if we were terrorists. Why are they alive? Because we're not there to kill people.
You accept soldiers were shot?
No, I don't accept that.
So do
you know how many soldiers died in the invasion of Gaza last year?
The point.
Do you know how they died?
I'm interviewing you. I'm interviewing you because you were involved in this.
Where's the video footage of shooting Israeli soldiers?
I'm interviewing you because you were involved.
I had a pistol in my hand. I had a 9mm pistol in my hand. I'm an ex-Marine. I've been in combat. I've served in a war situation. If I wanted to kill an Israeli soldier, I can guarantee you he would be dead right now.
How did you feel? Tell us how you felt when you were involved, because you were involved, as you say, you weren't on the top.
I felt like I was involved in protecting innocent people from dying. I'd already seen one dead body, and soon I saw several more, and this Israeli commando, for all I know, was the murderer of one of my brothers over there.
So you're holding
so
three
disarming him was saving life.
What did you do with those
attacking.
three? You make the point that you eventually released them. What did you do with the three that you were holding?
They were given medical attention by a doctor, and that's fairly well established at this point.
Were you angry with them?
Yes, I was. Yes, absolutely. They just killed people who were on a humanitarian mission. Of course I was angry. There were a lot of angry people.
Did you beat them up?
I didn't beat them up, no. No, I did not.
Did you
but I don't have a problem with those who defended themselves and who beat up, apparently, some Israeli commandos who were on board and killed 9 people, at least. What the hell is the problem with that? Sure. If somebody came in your home...
There are lots of people who would argue that, you know, that they shouldn't have done what they did. Israel might be the first to say that it regrets loss of life. But the argument is the extent of provocation. They say it was self-defense. And one of the commandos describes, the 4th commander to come down, describes landing and seeing his team leader with his own pistol being held to his head. And he says that is why he fired. Wow. Now, I know you weren't on the top deck, but you don't know that that didn't happen. And that would be an explanation. You're a military man. That would be an explanation of what triggered it.
The predictable consequences of what Israel did would be loss of life. And the loss of life was not on their side, it was our side. And the loss of life would have been on their side, except for we're not murderers. The Israelis are the murderers. We had 3 people, commandos, who may have been the murderers of our brothers, and they're living another day. They are going to feel the embrace of their loved ones once again, the sunshine on their skin, because we let them go.
What about the people that the other people on board that ship? Because one of the things that Israel says is that of the 700, there were 700 of you on that ship. Of that 700, 50 were extremists, as they call it. And the group that organized this, IHH, a Turkish group, has had some very extreme criticism of it in the past. And this is not just from the Israelis. Do you know enough about the people you were involved with?
You know what I do know? Israel has released a statement, the IDF has released a statement saying that I am involved in, quote, terrorist activity. I'm a radical, anti-Israeli activist, and, this is important, that I was going to Gaza to train commando units for Hamas. So, if you ask me, do I believe Israel when it repeats its lies? No, I don't believe Israel. They're lying consistently, and anybody with their eyes open can see that.
Forget Israel. Let's talk about a French magistrate, Jean-Louis Bruguière, who said of IHH that it played an important role in an attempt to bomb Los Angeles airport.
I've read that. That whole magistrate situation has been completely discredited. I invite everyone who's watching this program to go and see the evidence used by that magistrate to accuse IHH of any serious terrorist involvement. It's absolute rubbish as well.
He also talked of the leader of IHH, who was on the ship with you, that he had tried to recruit soldiers for a holy war in the 1990s.
You know what? We live in a world of Orwellian doublespeak, where the peacenik is the terrorist and the terrorist is the peacenik. I refuse to accept Israeli accusations when, in fact, they do everything they can to hide the truth. I'll quote Zippy Livni for saying in the invasion of Gaza that the Palestinians in Gaza, there is no humanitarian disaster in Gaza. This is how they feel about it, because if there
You don't like the French judge, you don't like Israel. What about the Danish Institute for International Studies said that the IHH was a front for funding terrorist groups?
Nelson Mandela was a terrorist, according to Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. So I guess maybe that man is falsely accused as well. Where's the evidence? Where's the evidence?
But isn't this changing the ground rules? I mean, this is in terms of what these people...
Changing the ground rules?
What do you know about AHH? What do you know about what they're doing?
It's not my job to go and spend time investigating every activity of every person that I deal with. I stand by what I've done, and I am proud to have stood shoulder to shoulder with my brothers from IHH and around the world who did the right thing, who refused to accept the unacceptable.
And with Hamas?
And Hamas... You know what? The IRA is now part of the government in Ireland, but they were the terrorists of their day as well. If Hamas had been allowed an opportunity to give the political chance, the political process an opportunity, maybe they would not be involved in violent resistance as they are. However, they have never been given an opportunity at all.
This is double standards. I mean, just as...
No double standard.
Well, in terms of the way you were talking about what Israel does and what you're talking about Hamas does, people were critical of the IRA when it did what it did, and it was only when it turned to political means that it was deemed acceptable. Amnesty says of Hamas that it engaged in a campaign of abductions, deliberate and unlawful killings and torture.
I do not stand by anyone or any institution that violates human rights. However, what I will say, yes, I do, and I will say absolutely 100% without reservation, I support the right of self-defense without any doubt. I would be involved myself in violent resistance if I were a citizen of Palestine or Iraq or Afghanistan. And if I were a citizen of the United States or Britain and someone from halfway around the world came into my country and started stealing my land and killing my family, guess what? I would defend my country as well. So I absolutely 100% defend the right of self-defense, and I will never shy away from that. I will not join the long list of embarrassments who condemn terrorism while forgetting to acknowledge that the biggest terrorist on the planet is the United States government for all of its terrorism around the world.
Do you accept that Israel has a right to defend itself?
Absolutely, every country does, and that's exactly why the hypocrisy and the lies of Israel are so transparent. Are you telling me we don't have the right to defend ourselves? When I saw dead bodies on that ship and we were hitting people with bars and sticks, we don't have the right to defend ourselves, but they do they?
Hamas doesn't recognize the right of Israel to exist.
You know what that sounds like to me? That sounds like the African National Congress and Nelson Mandela refusing to accept apartheid and recognize apartheid. I say that Israel, if it wants to be a genuine partner in any kind of peace, needs to destroy its whole ideology of Zionism. Zionism that makes other people goyim, who do not deserve to be in the Holy Land. That's the real problem. If Israel will embrace every people, including Palestinians, equally, human rights respected across the board, then I would challenge Hamas to change its charter and say we will acknowledge Israel. But until that time, I see no difference between Nelson Mandela and Hamas in refusing to accept apartheid or the Zionist Israeli state.
The Israeli government, their first job is to defend their citizens. They have rocket attacks from Gaza. They have intercepted, in 2009, the Frankop holding hundreds of tons of war material for Hezbollah. In 2002, the Karine A holding dozens of tons of weapons for Hamas, sailing to Gaza from Iran. They are trying to defend their right to exist. That is why their argument is it's self-defense.
And if you believe that, then I've got some swampland in Florida to sell you as well. If you wanted peace and you carried out the policies of Israel, then you'd have to believe that these people are the biggest idiots ever. It's like America saying it wants peace, yet conducting state-sponsored terrorism in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's a lie. Israel is lying. They don't want peace.
Are they lying when they say there was no humanitarian aid on the ship?
Peace for Israel, to them, and the Zionist agenda is the end of the Zionist project. They don't want peace. It's a lie. It's an absolute lie. And the policies, to any thinking person, reflect that. I can't speak for Hamas. I think that what I do know about Hamas is that they've actually done something to help their people. And they have also, I think, helped to give ammunition to their enemies by violating human rights and not doing everything that they should do to respect the rule of law. I'm not going to sit here and defend Hamas any more than I'm going to defend anyone who violates human rights. However, Hamas has done a lot to help its people, and for that it has to be given credit. And it also cannot be bought.
And do you not think that the Israeli people would say that of their own government? They elected it.
I actually think that the Israeli government is a reflection of the propaganda that has made the Israeli people so ignorant of the facts.
Or defensive. They are under constant rocket attack. They feel that they do...
How many people have the rocket attacks killed? These are glorified fireworks against the fourth largest military in the world with the latest technology and weapons of mass destruction.
3,000 rockets out of Gaza in the last 3 years.
3,000 rockets that killed how many people?
The point is that Israel feels under threat.
I think the rockets are a desperate attack.
Tell us this. Let's go back to what was on your... Let's talk about what was on your ship, because Israel says that there was no humanitarian aid on that ship. What was on it?
We had passengers on that ship who are expressing their humanity. In a way, that's a form of humanitarian aid. That was not the primary cargo ship. To deny that the cargo ships, which were also confiscated, didn't have things like cement, didn't have things like wheelchairs, didn't have things like medical supplies, is another lie. But that's just it. Israel just lies incessantly.
So why not? If you wanted to get this human aid through to the people of Gaza, why not do what they said? Dock in the port of Ashdod in Israel and allow even an Egypt or an international organization to deliver the aid?
Because it would be acting like a fool who believes that Israel has any intention of actually delivering all the aid that you're bringing. They don't allow cement in, they don't allow building supplies in, they don't allow all sorts of things, to the point that you have an unemployment rate that is the highest in the world, a poverty rate that's African levels. You have children who are malnourished and anemic. You have terrible, terrible hardship. Obviously, Israel doesn't want to let all the supplies in there.
So when
required.
Israel conducts this inquiry that it is into what happened,
it's a farce and a joke, and we all know that.
Even though it has David Trimble and Ken Watkin on it, the Canadian and
well,
Northern
you discredit
Ireland.
yourself now, David Trimble, don't you? You know?
If
Sorry.
they asked you, would you give them evidence?
Absolutely. I'm giving evidence right now. I have nothing to hide.
Would you go back to Israel to give them evidence?
I'm seriously considering that. Because you know what? There are thousands of political prisoners from Palestine, my brothers and sisters who I consider to be my family, who don't have the same opportunity that I do. They don't have that shining light on me. They don't have BBC interviewing me. Yet they're sitting there in prison, not having access to their family, and they're my brothers and sisters. So I'm thinking about it very, very seriously, even though I know there is no justice in Israel.
Do you fear for your life? You've talked about the fact that you might be on some
I
hit
believe in what Malcolm X said. When he was asked, what is the price for freedom? Malcolm said, the price for freedom is death. And if you're not willing to pay that price, then don't use that word in your vocabulary.
And did you think you were going to die?
Life.
Did you think you were going to die when you were on the Mavi Myanmar?
No, I thought we need to defend this ship. We need to succeed in this mission. We need to end this blockade. That was what was running through my thoughts.
You used to be a U.S. Marine. You've moved quite a long way from that.
Thank God for that.
You burnt your American passport.
I renounced my U.S. citizenship formally because I do not agree to the terms of citizenship. I refuse to pay into a tax system that's being used to commit mass murder, war crimes, and crimes against humanity.
Your anger, how will you use it next?
Based on love, and that's why I do what I do.
How will you use it next? What will you do
I've been
next?
involved in a project called Aloha Palestine, a social enterprise intending to do safe trade with Gaza, to bring in items counter to what Israel is getting from Britain and the United States, weapons of mass destruction, small arms and things like that, to bring in safe trade items such as things that are needed for the civilian population to live a decent life. And that is a problem that we need to address in this world, is the absolute lack of the Palestinian people to exercise self-determination, and living on aid is not the answer. So my focus is trade. And if I can't be the director of that company...
What about the other side? Because a lot is focused on the import, getting stuff into Gaza. Surely the best thing for the Gazan people would be to allow to export all that they do.
Yeah, and they have millions of carnations that they could be exporting, and they feed it to livestock because it's not allowed out. So is that a security measure from Israel?
So what do you do
well?
next? Is it another trip on a ship in to try to break the naval blockade, which will stay?
You know, I have a family. I'm a father. I have a beautiful son, a beautiful wife. And I have some responsibility to them, but I have a greater responsibility to the world that I live in. I don't know that it's possible for me to not be on the next flotilla. And I'd really like to say publicly right now, Hugo Chavez, you need to be on that flotilla. Nelson Mandela, if you can possibly do it, you need to be on that flotilla. Anyone who's serious, who has any real influence in this world, who really cares about justice, you need to be on that flotilla. We will end this blockade, and that's where I intend to be, on that next flotilla.
The chances of any of them going on that flotilla presumably were reduced when there was violence. Do you feel in any way responsible on the behalf of those on the ship for the violence that came from it?
I feel responsible for defending that ship and the mission, which was intended to protect innocent civilians who are being collectively punished in a policy which would only be considered insane by any thinking, compassionate person.
So it was worth it?
It was absolutely worth it. We need to do it again.
Ken OKeefe, thank you for coming on Hard Talk.
Thank you.
My guest today fought as a U.S. Marine in the Gulf War, but is now going to Iraq for a very different reason. His plan to lead a group of anti-war protesters and offer himself as a human shield in the event that an attack takes place. Is he an idealist or just a willing tool for Iraqi propaganda? Kenneth OKeefe, a very warm welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't you go to Iraq and tell Saddam that he can avoid war simply by cooperating with the United Nations?
Well, I think the United Nations has already dishonored itself. You remember back last July, the United Nations Security Council voted unanimously to provide immunity to the United States. There's 5 nations that have veto powers.
Why has it dishonored itself in the case of Iraq?
Well, I don't trust the United Nations to begin with, and they've dishonored themselves by saying that they would give immunity to the United States. So I don't really care what the United Nations says. I don't really care if they give a resolution endorsing war.
So you have no interest in what the world community And the 200 or so nations that make up the United Nations actually say...
Is the United Nations the world community? As far as I can tell, the vast majority of people on this planet stand directly opposed to this war. I don't believe the United Nations represents the world community.
Certainly represents a lot of the elected governments.
I don't believe the government of England is representing the majority of the people in England. I don't believe that the government of the United States is representing the majority there either.
You say most people against the war. The opinion polls aren't that simple. The latest opinion polls show division, but January the 19th, the latest poll in Britain, those who approve or don't know about a war amount to 53% of the population. That's not the majority against the war, is it? You can shrug, but it's not the majority.
I question that. I mean, I've just
Why?
heard that.
Because it doesn't tally with your own ideas.
No, not at all. How do you get 400,000 people out in the streets in London, 1 million in Florence, Italy, protests around the world? I think it's quite obvious that the vast majority of people do not support this war. And I don't think any logical thinking person would believe that the world will be a better place if U.S. bombs are dropped on an already thoroughly victimized people. I think that's an insult to our intelligence to believe that that would make the world a better place.
You can say that, but again, the figures don't back you up. It's easy to say that, but you haven't got the figures on your side.
You don't believe that the majority of people are against this war?
The governments say they're against the war. They say it's a last resort. They don't want to go to war unless it's a last resort.
Do you really believe
Each of the governments have said that.
Do you really?
Doesn't matter what I believe.
Well, I don't
believe. It's a matter of what the people out there believe.
Well, what's being said and what's really intended to be done are two different things, in my opinion. The United States...
Saddam Hussein has, because as you've been telling the rest of the world, they gave it to him in the first place.
Well, there's no doubt
so they
about
do
that.
know. They do know what he's got.
Well,
so when they say he's
had.
got it, they're
Right.
speaking from experience.
Is that not a major irony that they were the ones that gave him to him, and
that's
when
neither
he
here
was
nor
doing
there.
their
They know
bidding?
what he's got. You're saying he's disarmed. They know what he's got.
I really kind of resent this focus on others instead of focusing on the crimes of our own governments. Since our governments produced these weapons and provided them to these sadistic tyrants around the world, including Suharto or Pinochet or a long list of people like that, isn't it more important that we focus on what our governments have been doing instead of pointing the finger elsewhere, which we have little control over? I really resent this. The U.S. and Britain are criminal for having supplied these weapons and continuing that favored nation trading partner status after he committed his worst crime. So I would point the finger at ourselves first. Then we have a legitimate right to look at Saddam and the crimes that he's committing. But until then, we're hypocrites.
And Saddam isn't criminal to have used those weapons?
He is. Of course he is. But I do not have control over what Saddam does. But if we live in so-called democracies, then we are supposed to have true representation. And we do not, because the majority of people do not want to support vicious, nasty tyrants who are killing people. But what it does do for our governments, who, again, I do not believe represent us, is ensure that the flow of resources will continue to be plundered from the rest of the world back into the West, into the filthy rich hands of people who intend to carry out this war because they need to dominate the world by having the oil reserves. And by controlling the second largest oil reserves, they will basically have veto power over the world by controlling the means of production through the control of the oil.
So you don't think it's worth saying to Saddam Hussein, why not cooperate?
Now, well, Saddam Hussein...
The world has waited 12 years, during which time you've built up your arms again. You're skeptical about that too.
Well, they can't find them. Where are they? I mean, where are they?
The UN inspectors say we feel the declaration by Iraq to the UN has not answered a great many questions of the past. They haven't had long, have they? They've only had a few weeks.
What's the point of even having inspectors going in if Saddam is supposed to produce proof that he has nothing? How do you prove you have nothing? If the UN inspectors have a real job, then their job is to go in and find these weapons. They can't find them.
You say he's already disarmed from what we can tell. How do you know? How do you know?
Well, if he has anything, it's minuscule.
But how do you know? You make these glib statements which have no basis in fact. How do you know he's disarmed?
Well, we can't find him. Why do we have inspectors going in there?
Well, for 4 years we didn't have any inspectors in. They've only been in for a few weeks. It's a country of 177,000 square miles. It might take a bit of time.
Well, why even send in inspectors then? Why don't we just go ahead and drop the bombs and get it over with?
Isn't the point is that the Western governments know exactly what's...
Who want to see this kind of tyranny continue.
Peace depends on two sides in a dispute, doesn't it? And you only seem to be addressing one.
No, not at all. The Iraqi people, the last thing they need is for bombs to be dropped on them. I'm going down there. People can read into it whatever they want. But the fact is that I simply cannot stand by and watch another atrocity be committed on behalf of the West that I come from. It sickens me and it saddens me. And I would much rather sit down there with the Iraqi people Perhaps hug each other, look into each other's eyes, express our humanity, and if the bombs need to drop, then let the world watch that. And if that's the way they feel about it and that's what they want, well, then shame on all of us for allowing it.
You haven't worried so much about the Iraqi people and the plight they've been in for the last 12 years,
I wish I had done more. I wish I had done more. You're right. I have not done as much as I could have. When they were under repression and humiliation by their own regime, that's right.
Torture, execution. You haven't worried about that very much.
No, I've definitely worried about it, but I have not done as much as I could have.
Why not?
I'm trying to make
Why
up.
not? Why not?
Because I'm a human being, and I'm also subject to the same pressures and the same desires of any human being. I wish I could have done more. Now I'm trying to make up for it. If we want to look at what I couldn't have done, shouldn't we focus on the things that I can do now instead of what I haven't done in the past? And I have worked on issues dealing with human rights and other issues relating to the Iraqi situation. But I'm one person, and I cannot save the world, and I've never claimed to save the world, but I can do the best that I can do. And I hope that people will